Story 1. I worked at a special education preschool. A 4-year-old boy had missed a week of school. We found out he had pneumonia and was admitted to the hospital. When he came back to school, he asked me, "Did you know that when you are in the hospital you can eat until you are full?" I knew his family struggled financially, as most of our students' families did. Hearing him say that really moved me. I started sending him home with extra food as often as I could. Story 2. Early 2000s. A third-grade student asked, "Will you be my dad?" I later learned that he was in foster care and that it was not going well. Story 3. They are always asking for food, but one child said he did not eat for 3 days straight, and it just broke my heart. Story 4. My mother had a child ask, "Can I talk to you after class?" The child then proceeded to tell my mother that her father was sexually abusing her. My mother was very late coming home that day. Story 5. I was reading a book where a mouse runs away from his family. After he ran away, there was a line about, "There's not a daddy to play with me." One girl burst out laughing and said, "Daddies don't play." I quickly redirected before another child could say, "My daddy plays with me." Another time, a child said, "We just moved into a new house with a new daddy." The homes these children live in just break my heart. Story 6. This was before I was a teacher. I was a nanny for a very dysfunctional family. There were many moments with these kids. I worked for this family for 10 years, starting as a teenager until I finished my master's degree. I had tucked in the eldest. He was 7 at the time, and I had worked there for 4 years. I gave him a kiss and told him I loved him. I spent every day with these children, first just picking them up from school until they went to bed and during the entire weekend. After I turned 18, I moved in with the family. I loved these kids like they were my own siblings or children. He grabbed my hand and said, "Why do you love me? Mom and Dad don't. I'm a bad kid." He was a handful, I won't lie, got into trouble a lot at school and had a short temper. He is an adult now and was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder recently, which I think contributed. It didn't help that the parents were only really around 1 day a week. Even then, they would often ask me to look after the kids for a bit so they could go to the movies or a restaurant. I assured him his parents loved him, that he was a very lovable boy, and that even the loveliest people make mistakes and can behave badly, but that didn't make them less loved. I hugged him one more time and left the room, but I had to push down the lump in my throat for a bit. I'm not sure if my reaction was the best, but I was 20 years old and definitely not equipped for this kind of situation. These people had 4 kids, if you can believe it. Twins who were 1 when I started working there and a newborn, literally only a few days old. I am still in close contact with all of them. The youngest is now 17. Story 7. I was doing exams at a school for kindergartners. This little girl was next, and I asked her to read the chart, but she couldn't. We tried both eyes and distance. I did everything. I looked at her, and she smiled back at me with the sweetest, most tender smile. I said, "Baby, you haven't been able to see anything the teacher has shown you, and nobody noticed. How was that?" Story 8. I have had some real heart-wrenching situations with students, but not so much about things they said. I teach high school, and they tend to hide a lot more. The one that affected me the most was a student I had this past year who was autistic. Whenever he emailed me or asked questions about irregular school day activities, he apologized profusely for bothering me. I told him repeatedly that he was not bothering me and had no reason to apologize, but I also know it was something lodged in his mind that he would have to overcome on his own. Story 9. I worked with recent immigrants and refugees. I told my students that I would be moving to Japan the next year. The next day, one student asked me, "Do you know about the lost generation? Do you know about the suicide rates?" He asked me several more questions about some of the downsides of living in Japan. It turned out he had spent hours researching Japan and wanted me to know about every aspect. He told me he knew nothing about America when he was forced to move here and was terrified of the country and its people, so he wanted me to be prepared for my move. I cried in my car. Story 10. An 11-year-old child said, "You don't even know me. How can you care about someone you don't even know?" He is the saddest child, very hard on himself, and does not have many close friends. It is clear that he receives no love at home. You just want to adopt them all. It breaks your heart in two. Story 11. I'm a teaching assistant. Earlier this year, I worked with a student who had anger issues and refused to work. He was about 14. We bonded over our shared interest in metal music, and I gave him recommendations. Unfortunately, I was removed from that school because agency work is unreliable. On the day I was removed, he quietly said, "I hope you're here long term. You're the only person who doesn't see me as a failure. I hope he listens to the bands I showed him and knows that someone is in his corner. That school is not good for him. They only see him as trouble." Story 12. When I taught pre-kindergarten to third grade, I had a little girl who would have wild, screaming tantrums, yelling, "I hate you, I hate you." One day, I reached the end of my patience and said, "Libby, I love you," stopped her cold in her tracks. At just 3 years old, being told, "I love you," shocked her so much that she stopped screaming. Story 13. Not a teacher, but when I was in school, I remember one child asking the teacher if there was life after death. She said she was not sure, and the child responded, "I hope there is because I want to see my sister again." Story 14. I'm an ex-early childhood education teacher. The first boy was being picked up by his grandmother. He clung to me for dear life. He didn't want to go home to his parents. "Why can't you be my mom?" It turned out they were going through a divorce, and he found out his mother did not want full custody but shared custody equally. He thought she hated him. The second girl I was babysitting through the church. Her mother told me she needed to go to court to fight to keep her children out of her ex-husband's life. When the mother came home intoxicated at 4 p.m., I had to leave. This little girl kept crying that I couldn't go, that I was her mommy. Her little "why are you going?" breaks my heart every time I think of her. She was so angry at me. She never spoke to me again. I called Child Protective Services. The third boy was in the care of his aunt. I cannot go into his story without becoming very upset, so I will not. When his aunt came to get him, he went into full meltdown mode. Kicking, screaming, throwing toys, and punching. The aunt just stood there, having seen it many times, and waited. I removed the toys around him, knelt down, and sang to him the circle time song from that day. He really enjoyed it at circle time, so I thought it would help. After the third repetition, he calmed down and became himself again. He looked up at his aunt and asked, "Can she come home with us?" His voice was filled with a desperate plea and hurt that was overwhelming. I think about these three sometimes, and I truly hope they are doing well now. Story 15. I taught one semester of first-year seminar. The university I worked for needed part-time instructors, and I thought the stipend of extra money would be helpful. This was in 2021, so it was a freshman class who had just graduated during the thick of the pandemic. My class was about 17 students. Around October, I noticed one of the students started missing more classes. He said he was going through a hard time but wanted to catch up. I said I didn't want to fail him and was willing to work with him, but we needed to work out a schedule so he could realistically catch up with a passing grade. He completed assignments here and there but was rapidly falling behind. November came, and he surprised me by showing up near the end of one class period. He asked if he could talk to me after I dismissed everyone, and I said sure. We sat down, and I could tell he was trying not to break down. He said he didn't think it was going to be this hard, but he had been struggling in his classes. It was hard for him to be in class, to focus on his coursework, and it just felt like too much. He didn't disclose everything but said he had been to a doctor and had really bad light sensitivity and migraines resulting from it that felt debilitating. He had been to the office on campus for accommodations, but because it was so late in the semester, he felt like the damage had been done and he was going to have to do everything over again. I reassured him that even if he was delayed by a semester, it was better to know now about his diagnosis and how to accommodate it rather than continuing to hurt himself in other ways. He could potentially do more online courses or look into lenses that help reduce fluorescent lighting. He seemed to be in slightly better spirits, and then he said, "I came to tell you because I feel like you're the only teacher that cares about what happens to me. That broke my heart. I had to swallow the lump in my throat and reassure him I did care, that I was happy he felt comfortable talking to me, and that I would do what I could to help. But hearing that he thought I was the only one who cared about him tore me up. Story 16. On September 11th, while watching the towers fall on the televisions, I asked my fifth grade teacher point blank, "Is my mom going to be okay? She is in Manhattan on a work trip today." I have never seen the color go out of someone's face so quickly. My lord, she is fine. She has never spoken about what happened that day. Story 17. I am not a teacher, but was an American Sign Language student. My teacher told us a story about a deaf and hearing impaired child, 8 years old, who is learning how to sign. The child asked the teacher, "When I grow up, I'll be able to hear, right?" I am excited. My teacher had to hide her tears and made me feel bad for taking my life for granted. Story 18. I work with children and young people, and this happened probably about 13 or 14 years ago. A 12-year-old boy from a well-known, very troubled family that was abusive and lived in squalor regularly attended the youth project. One day, he came in with a cut on his arm. This cut had evidently been acquired several days earlier and was completely untreated. I don't think the boy had washed in days. His clothes were very dirty, and the wound was definitely infected and slightly festering. It was causing him pain, and he asked me to look at it. I did so and also cleaned the area around it while explaining that he needed to show his mother and ask to go to the doctor. The general consensus among staff was that she knew but had dismissed it. I mentioned that germs could get into his blood and make him very ill. I did not say he could actually die, but I explained that if it got very bad, the doctors might have to perform serious surgery, and he could end up losing his arm. His first question was, "Would it grow back?" At 12 years old, you would expect a child to understand that humans cannot regrow limbs. My heart broke that his understanding of the human body was so poor due to lack of parenting and inconsistent access to education. A phone call was placed to his mother, and a letter was sent home. The wound was treated, but we were fully prepared to inform social services about the neglect. They were already aware of the family. A year later, I took his 16-year-old brother to the emergency room because he had an infected cut on his leg. We could see the red line radiating up from the cut, which is a serious warning sign. The hospital likely referred the case to social services. Story 19. I was a day camp counselor for 3 to 4-year-olds. A girl accidentally knocked over her water bottle and it spilled everywhere. She immediately started sobbing, terrified. I helped her calm down and explained that it was okay. She didn't do anything wrong. She made a small mistake, but there was an easy way to fix it. I took her to the paper towel dispenser, and we cleaned it up together. The next day, the same thing happened, but she didn't cry as much. I told her mother she needed a better water bottle, though it was not replaced. A couple of days later, it happened again, but the girl didn't cry. She simply came to me and said she needed some paper towels. I believe she was punished harshly for every mistake she made at home. Story 20. I was running the Sunday school at my parents' church when I was a teenager. I had a 2-year-old who couldn't even properly pronounce the words but was swearing at me. His dad was right there and sort of chuckled, saying, "Don't say that." When the kid was out of earshot, I told the dad that in the future, he should avoid laughing in situations like this because at 2 years old, the child may not understand or remember your words, but he will remember your reaction. If the adults around him laugh at what he says and does, he is likely to do it even more. The next week, the kid's older sister came to me and told me that their dad asked her to say he was adequately punished after getting home for what he said to me. I asked what she meant by adequate punishment, and the poor kid had been locked alone in the bathroom for 2 hours. I felt his dad would probably not listen to me at that point because I was a teenager without children of my own. So I asked another church leader to intervene by mediating a discussion between me and the parents. We had that intervention, and the parents began approaching parenting in a more balanced way. They were not great parents after that either, but they stopped being abusive. The kid still had many emotional and behavioral issues for a while. When he was 4, he had a breakthrough moment with me when he fully realized that I was not going to be mad at him for acting out and that I was going to be a constant presence in his emotional support system. His behavior improved drastically after that day because he would come to me and ask for help if he felt any strong feelings he did not know how to express. His parents even started calling me to ask if I was willing to come over and help sometimes during the week. When I was about to move away for university, I announced it at church and brought small parting gifts for all the kids. That day after class, he, now 7 years old, came and snuggled my arm and said he would be good now and would also help the younger kids behave. I told him he was already good and that having a lot of energy and not being able to sit still did not make him a bad kid. I thanked him for promising to take care of the newer kids, but said it was not his job to do that. I told him I would inform the new teacher that he wanted to help. It broke me a little when he told me that he knew he had been a bad kid but would be good in the future and remember everything he learned from me. He was never a bad kid. He was a child doing his best in a difficult home situation, with parents who took offense when I suggested he should be screened for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Story 21. It is never about questions for me. What has broken my heart hundreds of times is when I lift my hand up to high five and they flinch. It hurts me every time. Do not hit your children. Story 22. No question, but I stood before the class very briefly years ago, and a young girl wanted to tell how her weekend went. She said they planned to go to a theme park. That's nice. Yeah. But eventually we didn't go. Oh, why not? My mother and father were having another argument. Father drank too much again, and mother doesn't like that. So she was angry at him and they had a fight. So we decided to stay home. It was the pure, casual way she told the story that broke my heart. She wasn't even disappointed. She didn't even think she was telling something that was not okay. She thought that was just how families were. Story 23. I teach unaccompanied foreign minors. Generally, they are tough teenage boys. They have experienced a long journey of wandering, marked by various forms of violence and injustice. They have a hard, surly shell. After some time together, when trust is established, some ask for a small, innocent hug. For a moment, they are children again. Children who have not seen their mother or father for months or years and just need a moment of tenderness. Every time this happens, my heart breaks for them. Story 24. My sister taught second grade, and we both volunteered for the summer program at her elementary school every year. For the Father's Day craft, I supervised the glitter station while the children worked on illustrated letters to their dads. A beautiful little girl with the most infectious laugh and a sweet heart wrote on her paper, "Dear Dad, I love you a lot more than you love me." The thing is, even if it was not factually true, something made that beautiful little girl believe it was. Story 25. Could you ask him not to scream at me since he is not my father? With that, it was clear where her struggles with male authority came from. Story 26. I wasn't sure, but a toddler told me that mommy loved her baby sister the most. I promised her that mommy loved her just as much as the new baby. Mommy just had to spend more time helping the new baby because she couldn't do things like the big sister could. I asked the big sister, "Do you know who the new baby loves most in the whole wide world?" "You." That cheered her up a bit. We made sure to tell the mother about the conversation so she could reassure the toddler herself that she was loved. Poor darling. Story 27. This was not a question, but when my mother was a teacher, she said every child was very excited about Thanksgiving coming up. One child said, "I am not sure what we are doing," in a sad voice. His parents were going through a divorce. She said she felt very bad for him. Story 28. A good friend of mine, a teacher, told me that once a child asked him, "If I am really good every day, will my mother come back?" His mother had left months ago. Story 29. I've got 2 points. Not actual questions, but rather utter confusion after I teased a misconception out of a student. 1. I had an entire middle school class spend 5 minutes on the 1 times tables and not get one correct. This involved putting the calculations and answers on the board. What's 1 times 1? 1. What's 1 times 2? I got up to 1 times 7 because I was hoping they'd get the pattern. Nope. 2. This is a longer story and thankfully only involved a lack of information in one student. Doing food webs with, again, a middle school class. emphasizing heavily on herbivore, omnivore, and carnivore, and added humans to a good web. The class was doing really well with identifying plants that humans eat, such as vegetables, cereals, and fruit. I said, okay, we've got plenty of plants, but humans are omnivores. What are some animals humans eat? One girl pipes up and says, humans don't eat animals. We do. No, we don't. The whole class expressed disbelief with this girl. She was getting more insistent. I finally asked, okay, what did you have for dinner last night? Vegetables and lamb chops. The class was totally incredulous now. I settled them down and said, you do know why it's called lamb, don't you? No. I breathed in and said, because it comes from lambs. You know, baby sheep. The follow-up was at the start of next term when she came up to me in the playground and said, my mum hates you now, sir. I tried to think what I did wrong, and she continued, I decided to become vegetarian and now she has to cook 2 sets of meals. I never thought I'd actually live out a Simpsons episode. Story 30. After telling me that she wanted to kill herself because she does not like her life, she said, maybe you could be my mother. She was 7. Story 31. This was not a question, but I had an 11th grader tell me that he was not used to people caring about how well he did at school. This was after I encouraged him to do an assignment. Story 32. Do you think my father can stay with us now because he has no legs? Asked an 11-year-old Ukrainian boy who came to Germany with his mother when the war began. His father stayed behind to fight. Story 33. Not technically a teacher, but I volunteered at a primary school when I was in 10th grade. One child told me he had never actually met his father. Supposedly, his father moved to Africa when he was still a baby, and his mother called his father a moron all the time. It was not heartbreaking, but made me pretty sad. Another 10-year-old said he was going to kill himself when he couldn't do the math questions. I promptly reported that to the school, which said they knew he had a difficult situation at home and would look into it. A little girl said she wanted to make a present for her mother because she worked really hard all the time and did not get many nice things. Story 34. I'm not a teacher, but I remember a couple of years ago in school when the quiet student in the class shared that he had been living on the street for the last 3 weeks. It absolutely broke my heart to know that he was also being bullied for having a bad odor. Story 35. Not in class, but I had a student disclose really serious sexual abuse to me. When the social workers and police were done talking to her at school and decided they needed to take her to get a video statement, they told her she would be leaving. She looked right at me and asked in a small voice, is the teacher coming too? I went with her in the social worker's car and stayed with her until the detective drove me home at 7 p.m. One of the other detectives told me that not everyone would have gone with her, but I do not know how anyone could have sent that little child off on her own with the police, especially not after she asked if the teacher was coming with her. Story 36. A couple of years ago, we experienced our first ever forest fire smoke in our city. No one knew what to do differently with the terrible smog, so we did what we always did. We just stayed inside during recess. I was an early childhood education teacher, working every day with preschoolers. One of the little girls I knew, who usually walked to school every day, was coughing a lot. We were in the gym and she was trying to play normally, running and throwing balls, but she kept coughing. After 30 minutes, we returned to the classroom, and she was still coughing occasionally. Eventually, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and asked, why won't I stop coughing? That broke my heart. She is better now. Thank goodness the smoke did not have lasting effects. As someone who also walked and biked to school, breathing had become physically painful for me, lasting a couple of weeks. I can hardly imagine the pain and panic that 3-year-old was experiencing. Story 37. We talked about immigration and how it is discussed politically in Norway. One of the children, aged 16, shared his story of fleeing his country. He described a moment when he had to sit on his knees with a gun to his head. His story made a lasting impact on me and changed my perspective on addressing the human aspect of those fleeing. It also sent chills down my spine, thinking about how many similar stories exist of people fleeing civil wars in Africa. I sincerely want to include and help everyone, but our country's integration system is only moderately functioning. Story 38. I've had too many to count, but two immediately come to mind. About 5 years ago, when I taught elementary school, my student's dad was deported. As she was leaving for the day, she looked up at me and said, "You're my dad now." I was, and still am, heartbroken for her. At the end of this past school year, I was discussing mental health with my juniors. I made some remark about leaning on family and friends when we are struggling, and one of my boys asked, "What if your parents don't love you?" Despite being one of the kindest students I've ever had, he had been kicked out of his house and was briefly homeless before moving in with other relatives. Story 39. Not a teacher, but on the opposite end of the interaction. It was near the end of the year, and some students and I were hanging out in the psychology teacher's room in high school. I don't remember how we got on the topic, but I casually mentioned how my sister used to beat me up, hit me, kicked me, held me down, spit on me, and slammed my head into the hardwood floor, talking about it like a funny story. Then everyone went quiet, and my teacher just said, "Name. I am so sorry." I asked, "Wait, is that not normal?" I swear you could have heard a pin drop. Story 40. Fifth grade boy with severe post-traumatic stress disorder from intense abuse. Every time a truck went by or there was a loud noise, he asked if we were safe. Story 41. I made cookies online using Messenger with the poorest refugee children calling in from another country. When I said, "So who is going to eat them now?" joking that it would be me since they were made in my kitchen, one of the girls who had absolutely nothing said, "Why don't you go out on the street and find some really poor people to give them to?" These beautiful children had nothing but were incredibly selfless. Story 42. They never put Asians on television. It was a year 5 class, 10 to 11-year-olds, in a multicultural school in Sydney. They said it so sadly. Not only was I stunned at how observant they were, but I remembered lamenting that I gave up on my acting career years earlier for that same reason, and that little had changed. Now it has been another 8 years since I taught. There has been some progress, but it is still a bit inconsistent. Story 43. I was a former teacher and used to hold monthly birthday celebrations for the class with pizzas and a birthday cake. One month, a 17-year-old girl told me that this was the first birthday cake she had ever received in her life, even if it was shared with a few other peers. I went back to the staff room and cried in my cubicle. I grew up poor too, but it still affected me deeply. Story 44. Just one perspective. I am an adoptive parent, and our youngest child, around 6 years old, had been with us for a year and a half. He started coming home with snacks from school and said they gave them to him. We contacted his teacher and his aide, as he has some special needs. They told us that he said we don't have any snacks. We were horrified because he always had a fruit basket with up to 20 choices. He is 16 now and still a handful. He goes shopping with me to help decide what snacks and food we buy. He makes dinner for the family once a week and is becoming a good cook. Story 45. I teach in a large middle school, and every 2 years we conduct a well-being questionnaire with many anonymous questions about all aspects of the students' lives to identify concerning areas or issues that need attention. They complete the quiz in the school computer rooms and submit it online. One year, while supervising my 7th grade class, a girl raised her hand and asked if she should answer affirmatively to the question, "Have you had sexual relations with anyone?" If it was rape, that deeply affected me. Story 46. Not a question, but out on the playground, all the children were running around playing their usual games when a helicopter flew overhead. All the kids, except 2, continued to play. The 2 children who suddenly stopped in their tracks and looked up scared were newly arrived from a war zone in Ukraine, where things flying overhead could have resulted in explosions. It made me very sad to think of them cowering in bunkers before they reached the safety of Ireland. Story 47. I'm currently doing my student teaching for my early childhood education bachelor's degree. Every semester, a few students occasionally ask if they can come home with me when I'm getting ready to leave for the day. I always give them a hug and tell them, "No, you can't come home with me, but I'll be back tomorrow," to let them know they'll see me again. On my last day of the semester, one student who always asked if she could come home with me would not stop crying because it was my last day in the classroom. while hugging me and crying uncontrollably. She said things like, "Why do you have to go? It's not fair. I'm going to miss you. Why can't you keep coming back?" She was pleading for me to stay and continue coming to their classroom until their last day of school. It was hard to explain to a first grader how student teaching in college works. So all I could say was, "I'll miss you too, but my classes are over, so I can't come here anymore." I felt so bad. I went to my car and cried a little. I had never had a student cry like that because I was leaving. Some of the students I work with grow very attached to me. It really hurts having to leave them when my semester is over. Story 48. In February this year, one of my Latino high school students turned and looked at me and, in a break from her upbeat, don't care attitude, asked, "Can immigration and customs enforcement really get us at school?" I fumbled through a response about them needing warrants and other paperwork to be able to get into the building and assured her they would be safe with me. I went home after work and sobbed for the rest of the night. Story 49. Can I hold your hand? This was said by a very young student who had just returned to school after seeing her mother murdered. Are we going to die? Said by a second grader who had only recently come to the United States during a lockdown drill. It feels like there is nowhere these children can be safe sometimes. Story 50. I was a kid before Christmas break in elementary school. We were supposed to bring a gift for a friend in class. I had no friends at the time, so I bought my teacher a tie with my own money. I even wrapped it. He was incredibly kind to me. I would describe what was going on at home, and he would let me turn in work late or give me full credit for missing assignments. He wore that tie to our graduation. I remember looking at him, and he pointed at the tie with a huge grin. As someone with a difficult home life, it meant the world to me that he liked the tie so much. Story 51. Can I sleep at the school with you? No, I'm going home at the end of the day. Can I go home with you? The child's parents were there to pick him up because he was sick. He stood in the corner crying, refusing to leave, and then asked me the above. Story 52. Many years ago, on what started as an ordinary Monday, when I was young and working at a school program for my town's poorest students and students already in the Department of Health and Human Services care list as at risk, labeled open protective, kids with no foster family or alternative place to go to stay safe. A little kindergarten girl I adored came to sit on my lap so I could read her a story while we waited for her mother to pick her and her older brother up. She turned her sweet, freckled little face up to mine and, out of the blue, casually asked me, "Do you know what my Uncle Sammy did?" The kids had visited their grandparents and uncle that previous weekend, and until then, I had never heard of this uncle. Then she proceeded to tell me exactly what her teenage uncle did to her at bath time and later, with his leather belt and its big metal buckle. Her little blue denim eyes grew big and bugged out, and the tiny pigtails on top of her head shook like antennas as she spoke and acted out how he hit her after her bath. It was a sickening experience. In those days, you had to sit there and be neutral, making sure not to appear horrified, homicidal, or even surprised, so as not to encourage or fuel the child's imagination. You had to keep the details and sequence of events in the story as accurate as possible in your head. Felt bizarre and robotic. I remember how I could almost feel my brain checking out and noticed how hard I clutched and white-knuckled the book she had chosen to have me read to her. Maurice Sendak's in the night kitchen, while holding my face as still as possible. I felt like I was watching myself from another place in the room. I don't think I even breathed the whole time she spoke. I sat very still, just listening and observing how her voice and body language changed as she spoke. That was a soul-breaking afternoon. We had to tell the mother, and somehow, after that conversation but before she got to the uncle's house in another state, someone in the family warned him that his big sister was on her way, with a gun. For him, I can't say I blamed her. It turned out later that the girl's big brother had seen everything and confirmed what she said to our in-house social worker for the state and to their mother. The uncle disappeared of his own volition, probably the only smart thing he ever did in his life, and I have no recall of what happened to him after. I do know the mother and the social worker or case manager got everyone a lot of help in therapy, and much more of the story came out over time. But yeah, one of those things that stays with you for decades after. Story 53. I was teaching health in schools that could not afford to hire health teachers. I was asked, "What if you got pregnant?" but your parents want you to terminate the pregnancy and you do not want to? The student was 14 years old. Story 54. I am a psychologist working for the equivalent of Child Protective Services in my country, but my work is more focused on providing reparative therapy to children who have been in difficult situations. I have a case, still ongoing after 2 years when the maximum should be 1, involving 2 siblings who were severely neglected and emotionally abused by their mother. We had to remove the little girl from the home because the mother threatened to crash on the road and kill both children. The boy had already been removed for trying to kill his sister. The mother ended up in a psychiatric ward on suicide watch because of this. 1 week in therapy. While discussing the situation, the girl looked at me with such sadness. After all, that reality was all she had ever known. We moved her to her father's care, but he had been alienated from her by the mother, never forming a proper relationship. She asked me, if my mom works hard enough on being good, can I be with her again? That broke my heart. We had been working with a social worker to encourage the mother to change the home dynamics that caused the boy to attempt to harm his sister again. We urged her to seek mental health help through direct contact with the psychiatric unit at the hospital. However, she was combative, never attended sessions, insulted us, claimed she was a good mother, and said we were all against her. Now that the girl is in her father's care, she looks cleaner, wears presentable clothes, and smiles more. But in every session, she asks to go back to her mom and brother because she misses them and still struggles to understand that their situation was not normal. We are still working on improving the broken bond with her father so she can finally have a happy and stable home. Story 55. Once we were talking about family in my class, and I asked one of my students a related question. When he couldn't answer, he said, I am sorry, teacher. My parents died when I was 3, and I can't relate to this question. Can you please pick someone else? He sat down with tears in his eyes, and it absolutely broke my heart because I didn't know. I had asked him a question really related to his relationship with his parents. Story 56. I used to teach high school mathematics, and for a couple of years I taught consumer mathematics. This is the math you always wished you learned in school: taxes, writing checks, loans, credit cards, and so on. Honestly, it should be required for everyone, but instead it was the class for seniors who had failed a math class somewhere along the line and needed another credit to graduate. Often, it was the second math class they were taking their senior year. The school I taught in was technically suburban but had a very diverse demographic. Some neighborhoods were very much in the city. When we got to the lessons about mortgages and how payments work, private mortgage insurance, and other related topics, one of the students asked me, why are we learning this? We're never going to own houses. It was just devastating. It was hard to respond. You can try to tell them things can be different, but all their lives they had seen their parents working multiple jobs just to pay rent and get by. Story 57. Right after the Orange One got elected the first time, I worked in a school for the special education department that had a good percentage of Latino students. A Guatemalan female student asked me if she and her family were going to get deported. That was our first interaction, and she barely spoke English. I honestly did not know how to answer, so I just said if he tried, he would have to go through me. The family went back to Guatemala over that winter break in 2016, and I have not seen or heard from them since. I hope you and your family are doing okay. You are a good and kind-hearted person. Story 58. Not a teacher, but a school bus monitor. I had many very sad interactions with children. 2 stand out. One was a 7-year-old boy who, on Valentine's Day, asked if I was single. When I said I was, he tried to set me up with his mother because, you're nice and she's mean, so maybe you could make her nicer. Part of my job was to walk the children to their houses if the stop was far enough away. His house was one of these, and I met his mother a few times. She was definitely a mean woman, and I have many suspicions about what goes on in that house. He often showed up with bruises and cuts, but always had excuses that were good enough, so that Child Protective Services did not investigate. The other was a little 5-year-old girl. On the first day, she was distraught because it was her first time away from her mother. I sat with her for the bus ride and talked to her. That afternoon, I asked how her day was, and she was bubbly and excited to share. Then she said, You should come over to my house and we can play with my toys. But we have to be quiet because my mommy brings people into the lounge and I have to be quiet. One time, a man yelled at my mom for me being too loud while she was working. It turned out the child's mother was a prostitute. She kept it secret from the child, but every adult in the school or the bus company knew. Story 59. Obligatory, not a question. I was an early childhood educator in the 2-year-old class, and one of my children was having a tough day, acting out and having multiple meltdowns. I had only been at this center a few weeks, but this behavior felt abnormal for him. He came up to me on the playground, sat in my lap, and told me he missed his mommy. I hugged him and said, "I know, honey, but you'll get to see her soon. We only have a little bit of school left today." After a few minutes, he got up and resumed playing. Another teacher told me his mother had actually passed away from cancer about 2 weeks before I started at the center. I cried the whole way home. I made sure to inform any new teachers or substitutes because I wasn't told until I had already made an awkward mistake and felt terrible for days. I didn't want anyone else to feel the same. Story 60. I once had a difficult moment with my teacher during distance learning because of COVID-19. I did not turn my camera on when it was required. I said I couldn't, but she told me I had to or she would contact my mother. So I turned it on. She asked where I was because it was clear it was not my room. I said I was at a women's shelter since my parents were going through a difficult time. She started to cry, and we took a break. Those were challenging times. Story 61. I was teaching English at a community college while in graduate school, and it was election day. I let all my students out early to vote and offered them extra credit if they brought back an "I voted" sticker. As we were leaving, an adult student whom I enjoyed having in class came up and discreetly asked, "What if we can't vote? You aren't going to have enough time today?" I said, "After thinking a bit," he said, "I mean, I'm not allowed to vote. Everyone is allowed to vote." I said, "It's your unalienable right." I was confused since he was clearly a native-born American. He spoke in a hushed voice, even though the room was now empty. "You can't vote in Kentucky if you've ever been convicted of a felony." I was shocked. This was over 15 years ago, and I was new to Kentucky. I had never heard this. It wasn't a law where I was from. He was such a good, thoughtful, intelligent student. It simultaneously broke my heart and opened my eyes. I let him know that I would think of another comparable way to earn bonus points. He thanked me and left. To rob someone of their right to determine who governs them, even though they have paid their debt to society, is sinister and degrading. It became clear to me that such policies were rooted in racism. That moment honestly shifted my understanding of almost everything. Story 62. She was an adorable little 5-year-old with big brown eyes. She looked up at me while we crouched under the classroom coat rack and asked why we have to lock the door and hide in the dark. Story 63. Not a question, but I had my college-age students doing a research paper, and one of them wanted to research the effectiveness of spanking children as a disciplinary measure. Fine, works for me. We sat down to talk about how she could find sources, and I asked her why she was so interested in the topic. She said, "Well, I don't think it was good for me when my mother made me go out back and cut my own switch to be spanked with." I just stared at her for a minute like, "What century did you grow up in?" Then said I was sorry to hear that and warned her about personal bias on the topic. Story 64. Can I take my school lunch home? My little brother did not eat yesterday. That one hit me in the chest and stayed there. Story 65. He didn't say anything. He just stood there with an empty bowl, like Oliver asking for food. I was helping at a rural school in Nicaragua. The rule was that if a child did not attend the first half of the morning, they would not get a meal. I completely understand the rule. It is meant to encourage children to arrive on time. But try explaining that to a child who cut the line for food because he showed up late, and tell him he has no right to a bowl of watery Maggie soup, knowing that was probably the only food he would have that day. Of course, I served him soup. But the head teacher saw him, took the bowl away, and reminded me of the rules. I still remember the sadness in the child's eyes. Story 66. My mom is a 3rd-grade teacher. Last year, she had a student, let's call him Danny. Danny was a child in crisis. He was in the foster system and had experienced trauma. I don't know much about his history, other than that one or both of his parents were abusive and there was severe neglect. Danny also struggled with mental health issues, likely oppositional defiant disorder and possibly others. One day, Danny was in another class when the teacher ran into my mom's classroom asking for help. Danny was having a meltdown, and my mom was the only adult he trusted and liked. She was the only person around whom he did not misbehave or become violent. My mom described the scene. Danny was screaming, yelling, throwing items and knocking over desks. The other children were scared. My mom asked what happened. A couple of the girls were teasing him, and they used his full name. He usually goes by Danny, but his full name is Daniel. He screamed at them, "Only my mom calls me by my full name, and my mom doesn't love me." So, the child was triggered into a meltdown by the use of his own legal name because his mother was abusive. My mom was very emotional telling me this. I am heartbroken for all of her children in crisis, but I am glad she has them because she often becomes their safe space. Story 67. This is not a question but a statement. A child was adopted out of foster care after suffering horrific abuse as a toddler. He was only 5 and in kindergarten when he started talking to me one day, while coloring, about what had happened to him. Horrific experiences included casual reenactments of his biological father punching him relentlessly. His new adoptive mother said the perpetrators are in jail now, where they cannot come out and hurt him ever again. The account was so graphic that I had to leave the room and sob in the hallway. Story 68. Not really a question, but a conversation that led to one. After class, one of my seniors, who was literally 2 months from graduating, was dragged into my classroom by a friend who encouraged him to tell her what's up. He told me his mother had thrown him out after an argument with his stepfather, and he was sleeping in his friend's barn. He became very upset and was in tears by the end when he asked me, "Why doesn't she love me as much as she loves him?" He was already 18, so guidance counselors had their hands tied. He ended up staying with my parents, who lived nearby, until graduation. We put him on a bus with a suitcase of my brother's hand-me-downs to his biological father, who had lined up a job for him. I became persona non grata at that school after his so-called mother bear tried to intimidate me into letting him fail so that he would come crawling back to her. Felt very liberating to leave the area the following year. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.